Consider this before viewing Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion, Part 1. Pizarro and his fellow conquistadors brutally oppressed the Incas. As you watch the program, think about how so few Spanish conquistadors could conquer so many indigenous people. What are some factors that contributed to the downfall of the Incas? Assignment Discovery now presents Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion, Part 1.
"500 years ago, Spanish soldiers of fortune invaded the native empires of the Americas. They plundered treasure and started a gold rush. One man, Francisco Pizarro, marched high into the mountains of South America and conquered the greatest empire of all, the Inca. But his brutal invasion leads to mass rebellion and threatens to shatter his dreams of conquest. The exploits of this handful of Spaniards changed the destiny of a continent and won them eternal fame as the Conquistadors. Peru, 1536. The great Inca Empire teeters on the brink of ruin, torn apart by years of civil war, invasion, and deadly plagues of European disease. For 4 years, Spanish conquistadors led by Francisco Pizarro and his 3 brothers have brutally oppressed the proud Incas. The conquistadors forge alliances with native groups hostile to the Incas and seize enough treasure to make Spain the most powerful nation in Europe. With the young Inca Emperor Manco under their control, the conquistadors believe their domination of the vast Inca Empire is complete. But rebellion threatens their conquest. In a last-ditch attempt to rid themselves of the conquistadors, a massive Inca army of over 100,000 men attacks the Spaniards occupying the sacred Inca capital, Cusco. They force the Spaniards and their native allies to fall back into 2 Inca palaces in the heart of the city. The Spanish garrison, commanded by Pizarro's brothers, face almost certain annihilation. Their only hope is 700 miles away on the coast. There, in the Spanish capital Lima, Francisco Pizarro has heard that his brothers are under siege in Cusco, and that the rebellion is led by the puppet king he himself crowned, Manco. He feels betrayed. Four years earlier, in 1532, when Pizarro first invaded Peru, Manco was an 18-year-old fugitive on the losing side of a bitter Inca civil war.
Manco Inca was a Cusco-born lower nobility, and he had had absolutely no chance of becoming Inca. However, the plague, the civil war had cleaned the slate in front of him.
Manco then had a chance to become emperor. He approached the conquistadors as they prepared to march on Cusco, the Inca capital.
Manco comes to Pizarro and says, "I'm the rightful Inca of Peru now that all these other people are dead. You and I can come to some arrangement."
Soon after they entered Cusco, Pizarro crowned Manco as the emperor of the Incas.
They found themselves willing collaborators. Pizarro had a puppet Inca, whereas Manco found himself the ruler of the world, which he had not expected to be before.
At first, he cooperated with his new Spanish allies. When Pizarro's partner Almagro led an expedition to Chile and Bolivia, Manco provided him with 12,000 native troops.
I think that Manco was hoping to contain the Spanish threat by making at least a temporary alliance with the Spaniards. The Spaniards at first also were trying to make use of Manco in much the same way. They wanted him to be the sort of puppet ruler who would keep the native population docile and would provide them with wealth in the form of gold, but also with food, with women, with the products of this empire that they had conquered.
The arrangement worked, but not for long. The wealth the conquistadors were sending back to Spain set off a gold rush to Peru. Spanish soldiers of fortune, greedy for gold, were arriving by the boatload, changing the balance of power against the Inca emperor.
Within a year, Manco Inca sees his power beginning to erode. He can see that the Spaniards are listening less and less to him.
Manco soon saw that the real power in Cuzco lay with the Spaniards. He was becoming a pawn in the deadly feud between Almagro and the Pizarros over the riches of Peru.
Manco Inca finds himself in a situation where he believed he would be ruler, but he's increasingly aware that he is in fact a puppet ruler.
His predicament was about to get worse. In July 1535, Almagro headed south to conquer new lands. Francisco Pizarro went to the coast to found his new capital at Lima. He left Cuzco in the hands of his ruthless younger brothers, Juan and Gonzalo.
They began to abuse Manco, and they would ask him for treasure, and if he failed to deliver it, they would chain him up, as he put it, like a dog, all night in his own palace. And it went worse than that. They demanded his wives. This mighty Inca emperor has been reduced to this person who is being systematically and savagely abused by these thugs who have become almost like a virus that has got into his country, that is eating away at it and destroying it, and which he doesn't know how to get rid of.
Manco tried to escape Cuzco, but he was captured by the Pizarros. They imprisoned and tortured him.
The point at which Manco snaps seems to have been after the Spaniards begin to abuse him in these very insulting ways. That personal sense of grievance is very much part of a larger vision, a vision that these people are incompatible with us. We're never going to be able to live side by side with these people. We cannot form an alliance with them because they are untrustworthy and will take advantage of any weakness on our point. So we have to get rid of them.
As the Spaniards continued to control Cusco, they began to enter into the daily affairs, and they began to become ever more present on the political scene. And I think that's when the native people of Cusco began to see that the empire was crumbling and that Manco Inca needed to escape and set about a new civil war for control of the empire.
Manco gave the outward appearance of compliance with the Pizarros, but he was simply biding his time, waiting for the rainy season to end. In April 1536, Manco tricked the Pizarros into letting him leave Cuzco. He promised to bring back hidden gold treasure. Instead, he convened a council of war. Each leader pledged an oath. For Manco, it was reconquest or death.
Manco is facing a superhuman challenge. He's got to somehow not only reassert his authority as the divine emperor of this empire, which is shattered by plague and civil war and invasion, but he also has to try and oust these invaders who are in his capital and to try and assemble a force secretly in order to do that.
The Incas secretly stockpiled weapons. Manco ordered extra plantings of crops to ensure sufficient food for the coming war. He recruited thousands of men from every valley, farm, and village to join the rebellion.
He had to wait until after the harvest to raise these forces, until after the end of the rainy season, and they had planted their fields for the next harvest. He had to wait until that moment in the agricultural cycle when he could raise these levies. So certainly many of them were simply yeoman soldiers from the peasantry. But they were organized under professional generals. Manco also faced a military problem in that the professional core of the Inca army had been split into two factions by the Civil War. So the number of veterans that he could call on was cut in half by the Civil War, and also had been severely cut down by the plague. I mean, we know for a fact that many Inca generals had died in that plague.
The Inca generals formed units to attack the Spanish throughout the country. But the main army was to be concentrated on the Inca imperial capital, Cuzco. With the end of the rainy season, huge contingents of Inca warriors moved undetected on Cuzco. They hid in the Vilcanota Valley, only a day's march from the imperial city. When news of the threat reached Cuzco, Juan Pizarro led out his cavalry to crush the rebellion. But the Spaniards were stunned by the sight that greeted them at the head of the valley. One soldier reported, "So many Indian troops were there that they covered the fields. They looked like a black carpet covering everything." The valley was filled with an army of over 100,000 Incas.
Manco Inca used traditional Andean war techniques, which was simply to assemble a vast amount of warriors and lay siege on a city. This had been a successful battling technique which had been used by his father and his grandfather. It was the way that they had spread the empire from the valley of Cusco across the Andes.
The Inca scouts spot the Spaniards making their way back to Cuzco. The Incas' plan is to create a diversion large enough to keep the Spaniards occupied, so that more of Manco's troops can descend on Cuzco without the Spanish attacking. Manco's tactic works. News of Manco's army so close leaves the conquistadors feeling vulnerable. The Spaniards are cut off 700 miles from help and face almost certain death. Manco's generals plead with him to attack, but the emperor insists on waiting until his army reaches full strength. He knows he has to fight more than 190 Spaniards.
He has not only the Spaniards to fight in Cusco, but he has various native groups which have allied themselves with the Spaniards because they see the Spaniards as a way to break the rule of the Incas across the Inca Empire.
At the beginning of May 1536, the main Inca army moves out of the Vilcanota Valley and marches on Cuzco. Fearing a full-scale attack, the Spaniards ride out of the city and strike first. But the Spaniards have only 80 horses. The Incas easily push them back into Cuzco.
By this time, the Incas were very familiar with the kinds of weapons the Spaniards had, and they knew that the one thing to be avoided was to be caught out on an open, level surface where the Spaniards could use their cavalry.
The Incas flood the fields around Cuzco and dig pits to trap the Spanish horses. Though their weapons are useless against an armored horseman, they can bring down his horse with the bolas. The twirling missile tangles itself around a horse's legs with deadly effect. On May 6th, 1536, Manco orders the main attack. To stop the cavalry, the Incas throw up barricades in the narrow streets. After 6 days, they force the Spaniards and their Indian collaborators to retreat to 2 palaces around the main square.
They, in addition to being palaces, were very effective fortresses because they had these huge stone walls that were at least a yard thick. But they only had 1 or 2 entrances to an entire block, and the entrances were just narrow entrances like a door to an ordinary house. So it's very hard to get at somebody who's inside one of these things, especially if they're armed.
These Inca buildings have only one weak spot.
You had these straight but narrow streets leading in between these huge walls of absolutely perfect Inca masonry, the finest stonework that has ever been built anywhere. The stone walls rise 20, 30 feet high in the big buildings, but the buildings were roofed with thatched roofs. So Manco comes to what must have been the most painful decision in his life, and that is to burn the sacred city of his ancestors, to set fire to these magnificent thatched roofs and literally burn the Spaniards out of Cusco. His men get red-hot stones, which they wrap in cotton, and they hurl from their slings into the thatched roofs so that these stones go into the thatch and start to set it alight. And it took the Spaniards a long time to work out how the fire was even being started, because they didn't see anyone lighting a fire. They just suddenly, the thatches started to go up.
The city is soon engulfed in flames. The Spaniards are trapped. The whole city of Cuzco is ablaze, except for the 2 palaces sheltering the Spaniards.
The Spaniards later attributed this to the Virgin Mary, who they said was seen to come down and smother the flames with her skirts, and it was heralded as a miracle.
Manco fails to burn the Spaniards out, but their supplies of food and water are almost exhausted. Inca accounts record their desperate plight.
They could see no hope of relief from any direction. They were extremely frightened because there were so many Indians and so few of them.
The battle for Cusco was a siege. It was fought mostly during the days because the Incas did not fight at night. During the night, the Spaniards were able to reorganize and plan for the next day.
The Pizarro brothers hatch an audacious plan: to attack the Inca fortress on a hill above the city. Sacsayhuaman was one of the greatest stone structures ever built and virtually impregnable. The outer walls soared 60 feet above the ground, and at that level there were parapets.
Some of the individual stones weigh 200 or 300 tons and are among the largest blocks of worked stone ever quarried and moved by human beings.
More than 2,000 Inca defenders, armed with slings and lances, are stationed on the walls. It seems like suicide, but if the Spaniards can capture the Inca headquarters, they believe they can break the siege. The cavalry, led by Juan Pizarro, charge out of Cuzco, smashing through the surrounding Incas. Joined by their infantry and native troops, the Spaniards gain a foothold in the hilltop fortress. But a stone hurled from the ramparts hits the Spanish commander, Juan Pizarro. Pizarro's wound is fatal, but his death hardens Spanish resolve. The Inca defenders are running out of stones, and the heavily armed attackers pour into the fort. Manco's son later wrote,
"There was terrible confusion. Everyone was shouting and they were all entangled together. It looked as though the whole world was up there grappling in close combat."
Defenseless against steel, the Incas are slaughtered. Faced with defeat, the Inca commander hurls himself from the ramparts. Others follow, till the bodies are piled 10 deep. The Spaniards put all 1,500 survivors to the sword. Manco is furious at the loss of his citadel. He knows this defeat could prove the turning point in the rebellion.
"You have disappointed me. There were so many of you and so few of them, and yet they have eluded your grasp."
Not only has he lost his main fortress, but the defenders are now lodged in 2 great strongholds, Sacsayhuaman and the palaces at the heart of the city. Manco knows he cannot maintain the siege forever. But the Spaniards in Cusco are still outnumbered, cut off from reinforcements, and desperately short of food and water. Salvation comes in the form of a herd of llamas. Natives disloyal to Manco tell the Spaniards that not far from the city are thousands of llamas, which the Spaniards could use as pack animals and, more importantly, food. The Spaniards immediately dispatch a small force. One soldier recalled, "We went and rounded up almost 2,000 and returned with them to Cusco without having any serious engagement." 700 miles away, at his headquarters in Lima, Francisco Pizarro is anxious for news of his beleaguered garrison in Cusco.
Up until this moment, Pizarro had dedicated himself to founding Spanish cities all over Peru, and this rebellion by Manco Inca interfered with his plans. The only thing he's worried about now, however, is sending expeditions inland to break the siege of Cusco and rescue his brothers who are trapped inside.
From Lima, Pizarro sends expeditions up through the steep valleys of the Andes to raise the siege and reopen the vital supply routes between Cusco and the coast. But Manco is ready for them.
Now that you've seen Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion Part 1, talk about this. The Spanish conquered the Incas, despite being greatly outnumbered. Analyze the strengths and weaknesses of both groups as they struggled for control. Discuss the Inca strategy for defending against the Spaniards. Now try this. Imagine the internet was a means of communication in 1536. Design a website that Manco Inca might have used to gain support for his cause and to expose the atrocities of the Spanish conquistadors. For videos, CD-ROMs, lesson plans, and teacher resources on this topic and more, log on to discoveryschool.com. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Conquistadors by Michael Wood. Consider this before viewing Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion, Part 2. As you watch the program, think about why Manco Inca waited so long to rebel. What strategies did Manco Inca use to attack the Spanish? What were some of the weaknesses in the Spanish defense? And how did the Incas plan to exploit these weaknesses? Assignment Discovery now presents Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion, Part 2.
Manco has units throughout Peru with direct orders to kill any Spaniards they can find.
The most effective techniques were to wait until the Spaniards were in a very difficult bit of terrain, and there's plenty of that in Peru. Lots of chasms and ravines and places where they could be trapped and unable to make much use of their cavalry. And then the Indians would ambush them and roll down rocks on their heads and come in and kill them at their leisure. Manco's campaign had a great deal of success. People were coming in with Spaniards' heads, even the heads of horses, and throw them down and say, you know, we're winning this thing.
Manco studies Spanish military techniques and even learns how to ride a captured Spanish horse.
He himself rides a horse into battle to show that, you know, we can do this too. Psychologically, there must have been an enormous boost for the Inca army to know that within a matter of a year or two from these people showing up in their country, they have mastered, or very nearly mastered, their technology and have some of it on their side too.
Desperate, Pizarro sends letters to all the Spanish governors in the Americas, including the conqueror of Mexico, Hernan Cortés. The country is so badly damaged that no native chiefs now serve us, and they have won many victories against us. It causes me such sorrow that it is consuming my entire life. Pizarro sends a lieutenant to Panama to hire soldiers and buy weapons and horses. But it will be months before they arrive in Peru. Meanwhile, Manco has moved his headquarters to the fortified town of Ollantaytambo. 50 miles from Cusco, Ollantaytambo lies strategically at the head of two valleys. Its fortress stands on a cliff surrounded by steep terraces. From here, Manco's rebellion continues to spread. As soon as fresh Spanish troops arrive in Lima, Pizarro sends them up through the steep and treacherous valleys of the Andes to relieve Cusco. But the rugged terrain proves an ideal killing field for the Inca armies.
He managed to exterminate just about every Spaniard at large in Peru except the force in Cusco, the force in Lima, and a force that had gone down to southern Chile to try and consolidate the Spanish gains at the south end of the Inca Empire. He sensed that victory might be within his grasp. His son later writes, "These were the finest days of my father."
But on the verge of winning back his country, Manco's luck begins to change. In August 1536, he orders his generals to attack Francisco Pizarro and destroy Lima.
Leave no single house upright and kill any Spaniards except for Pizarro himself.
The Spaniards fortify the city. Lima is a port and their sole lifeline to the outside world. If they lose it to the Incas, they will be cut off from reinforcements. But the Incas make a fatal mistake. They confront the Spanish cavalry on the flat, open plain outside the city.
So the Spaniards are very effective at using cavalry units to run into these dense formations of Indian troops and to break them wide open with just heavy onslaughts, heavy gallops into the middle of the formations.
It's a disastrous defeat. Manco's best general is killed. The surviving troops are forced to retreat leaderless into the highlands. Manco has lost the crucial battle for Lima. The length of the siege is beginning to take its toll on Manco's army.
The problem for Manco really is that the siege of Cusco goes on too long. He can't finish off this force of Spaniards holed up in the center. The other thing that's happening is that his levies reach the point where they have to go home and plant their fields or everyone will starve in the empire. Manco had foreseen this and had made extra secret plantings of corn before he even started the siege. But there came a point where those supplies were running out and these people had to go home. The siege begins to disintegrate.
Manco is devastated. He has failed in his main objective, the capture of the ancient Inca capital. In late 1536 and early 1537, reinforcements began to pour into Peru from Spain and Central America. Two powerful Spanish armies advance on Cusco. From Lima in the north, Francisco Pizarro sends 550 men. From the south, another Spanish army marches towards the besieged city. Pizarro's old partner, Diego de Almagro, is returning empty-handed from Chile to claim his share of the Inca Empire from the Pizarros. Diego de Almagro is a bitterly disappointed man. 10 years before, he'd helped plan Pizarro's original expeditions to Peru. He'd lost an eye in a fight with coastal Indians, for which he blamed Pizarro. And he felt he'd been cut out of his share of the spoils of conquest. To resolve the dispute, the Spanish king divided the conquered empire of the Incas into two parts. Pizarro was given the north and Almagro the south. But the ancient Inca capital of Cusco was in the middle, and the two factions fought to control it. Almagro was temporarily appeased by the allure of new riches to the south, until he found it was mostly desert. Now, after almost 2 years away, Almagro is coming back to claim his half of the Inca Empire. He wants Cusco as his capital. But the besieged Pizarros have no intention of surrendering it to him. The struggle for Cusco would now be a struggle between Spaniards. As Almagro approaches Cusco, he tries to forge an alliance with the Incas against the Pizarros. He sends a delegation to Manco's headquarters at Ollantaytambo, offering to restore him as Inca ruler. He rejects Almagro's offer and withdraws the remnants of his army from around Cusco to let the Spaniards fight over the city. In April 1537, Almagro enters Cusco opposed only by the Pizarro brothers. After a brief struggle, he takes the city and captures the Pizarros. Almagro intends to go to the coast to resolve his dispute with Francisco Pizarro. But Almagro can't leave Cusco undefended, while Manco Inca is only 50 miles away. He sends his cavalry to Ollantaytambo to capture Manco. With an ever-shrinking army, Manco is finally compelled to flee his headquarters. He needs an isolated refuge beyond the reach of the Spaniards. He thinks he has found it in the remote town of Vitcos, deep in the Andes. But Almagro's men are relentless. They launch a surprise attack on Vitcos. While the Spaniards loot the rich treasures of the town, Manco escapes with a handful of followers. He is forced yet again to abandon his stronghold and flee even deeper inland to the inaccessible jungle of Vilcabamba. There he begins to build a tiny Inca state. With Manco forced into the jungle, Almagro went to negotiate with Francisco Pizarro. The Pizarro brothers had escaped from Cusco and joined Francisco on the coast. Almagro and Pizarro couldn't reach a deal, and open war breaks out between the Spanish factions. In April 1538, the Pizarros lead an army against Almagro in Cusco. It culminates in the Battle of Las Salinas. The Incas looked on amazed as hundreds of Spanish soldiers clash in the valleys of highland Peru. Almagro's army is destroyed, and Almagro taken prisoner by the Pizarro brothers. They intend to put an end to the problem once and for all. But Francisco Pizarro still feels some personal loyalty to his old friend Almagro.
Francisco Pizarro travels from Lima to Cusco with the intention of saving Almagro. But his brother has other ideas and has Almagro executed before Pizarro arrives. Then, when Pizarro finally does arrive in Cusco and sees that Almagro has been killed, he is deeply shocked and slips into a kind of depression. Pizarro then becomes enraged and takes it out on everyone around him.
With the Spaniards divided, Manco sees a new opportunity for revolt. From his new settlement at Vilcabamba, he launches a guerrilla war along the length of the Andes. The second rebellion is more deadly than the first. More than 1,000 Spaniards are slaughtered, over half the Spanish population of Peru. Pizarro was now determined to put an end to Manco's second rebellion. He wrote to the Spanish king, "When summer comes, the Inca will not be able to defend himself against me, for all the land is against him. I will have him in my hands dead or as a prisoner." Pizarro sends an expedition of 300 soldiers into Manco's jungle refuge at Vilcabamba. They are ambushed by the Incas and lose 36 men, but the Spaniards press on to the remote stronghold. They capture Manco's wife and several Inca commanders, but the Inca leader narrowly escapes and goes into hiding. Manco sends envoys saying he is willing to surrender. Pizarro sends a delegation to meet with him. On an impulse, Manco kills them all, even the gift horse, saying,
"It is far better for me to cut off their heads than for them to depart with mine."
Pizarro then burns alive Manco's high priest and chief advisor and executes 16 of his captured commanders. The odds are rapidly stacking up against Manco. And he faces the hidden weapon the conquistadors had unwittingly brought with them: smallpox. With no immunity to European diseases, the Indians are dying by the thousands.
It's as if a germ weapon has got out. People often ask, how is it possible that this tiny force of 200 Spaniards was able to defeat these huge Inca armies? All the time these events are going on, you have to remember that the population of the Inca Empire is collapsing. Those relentless two forces of disease cutting down the Indians, while This gold rush is continually restocking Peru with Spanish desperados. Those are the things that make it harder and harder for Manco, not just to find loyal people, but to find any people at all. And on the other hand, you also have groups allying themselves with the Spaniards, people who were not happy with Inca rule. The Spaniards minimize those things. The Spaniards don't mention the plagues very much, if at all, and they don't mention the important role of the native troops, because the Spaniards wanted to tell the King of Spain how they did this all with their own valor and for the glory of the King and Christ. And they don't want to talk about the fact that, oh, by the way, while we were there, smallpox broke out and made it easy for us.
The Bishop of Cuzco wrote to the Spanish king, "The Inca who is in rebellion is nearing the end, for he leads very few men. The Indian natives are so weary of war that they will not follow him, but remain in their villages. Manco's second rebellion is over." Waves of Spanish settlers continue to arrive in the gold rush to Peru as the conquistadors bitterly fight each other for control of the country. Pizarro seeks refuge in his capital, his house, and his family.
Francisco Pizarro's life in Lima was fitting for a man in his old age. He lived happily in general. He had 4 children whom he'd had with 2 Inca princesses. And of course, he was surrounded by his closest friends.
But Pizarro's bloody past is about to catch up with him. The murdered Almagro's son is bent on revenge. Spanish feuds are once more threatening the conquistadors' domination of Peru. On June 26, 1541, armed Spaniards, led by the son of the murdered Diego de Almagro, enter Pizarro's palace in Lima. After Pizarro's death, Manco continues the Inca resistance from his jungle stronghold. But he makes another fatal error. He tries to play the Spaniards off against each other, giving refuge to 7 of Pizarro's murderers.
The biggest mistake that ultimately undoes Manco is that he deviates from this policy of just wanting to exterminate every Spaniard he can find, and he lets the assassins of Pizarro into his capital at Vicos, and they stay there for a long time and become quite cordial with Manco.
One day, while playing horseshoes, the Spaniards seize the moment.
They take the chance to kill Manco in the hope that that will enable them to return as heroes and be forgiven for their treachery against Francisco Pizarro. That is how Manco dies. He's stabbed during this game of horseshoes, but doesn't die immediately. His son records with some satisfaction that Manco lived for 3 days, long enough to know that these Spaniards were captured before they could escape and were given very cruel deaths.
The murderers are locked in a house and burned alive. Manco had almost expelled the Spaniards from Peru. His tiny Inca state of Vilcabamba held out for another 30 years before being crushed by the Spaniards.
Manco is the great hero of native resistance in Peru. He is the man who says, the Spanish conquest has not ended. We can still turn this back. He lays the template for the kind of cultural resistance that has continued in the Andes over the next 450 years.
In Spain, the exploits of the conquistadors were widely celebrated, but their days were numbered. King Charles of Spain realized he couldn't trust the feuding conquistadors to run his new empire.
When Pizarro is assassinated in 1541, that signals the end of a whole era. This is the end of the conquistadors. The need for these self-made men was over. These guys were actually more of a liability than they were a plus. And you begin to wonder how many of these men were not coming to bad ends simply through the machinery that was going on with their princes, their former employers. I suppose you could say to live by the sword and die by the sword, but these guys had basically seen the last of their era. There was no use for them anymore.
Spain sent new waves of conquerors to Peru, men armed with crosses and laws. They tried to impose Christian religion and Spanish culture on the Incas, as Manco had predicted.
The Incas and the Spaniards really found that they were two incompatible civilizations. You could not find two peoples more different in their values and their way of doing things than the Incas and the Spaniards. That incompatibility runs all the way through the succeeding 500 years to the point where Peru is still a nation divided. To this day, the Andean Indians have traditions that the Inca king will come back from the grave and lead them to victory, and that the rule of these Spaniards will be overturned and native people will be masters in their own house once again.
In 20 short years, from the arrival of Cortés in Mexico to the death of Pizarro in Peru, the reign of the conquistadors was over. But these few soldiers of fortune had conquered empires and claimed territories stretching from Mexico to the tip of South America. Their conquests sealed the fate of the Americas.
Keep watching. Discussion topics and activity and resources for Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion Part 2 are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Conquistadors, Inca Rebellion Part 2, talk about this. Discuss the actions of the Spanish conquistadors from the time of Pizarro's arrival in Peru to his death in 1541. What are some events that led to the Spanish victory and destruction of the Inca Empire? Now try this. Consider Francisco Pizarro's place in world history. Conduct a class debate to determine whether Pizarro should be considered a hero or villain. For videos, CD-ROMs, lesson plans, and teacher resources on this topic and more, log on to discoveryschool.com. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The Incas by Michael Wood.